Hello, and welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. I'm Holly Baker, podcast producer for the University of Central Florida's History Department. Today's podcast features an interview with Andy Huse. Andy Huse wrote an article in the winter 2019 issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly called War, Fear, and Bread in Tampa, 1917 to 1918. Have a listen to our conversation. I read your article, War, Fear, and Bread in Tampa, 1917 to 1918, in the winter 2019 issue, and I would like to know more about it and what bread has to do with it. It's a very interesting article, so thank you, first of all, for writing that.
Of course. Well, I'd like to start with a shameless plug, and that's the image. My cover image is part of this book. I can't really see it. From Saloons to Steakhouses, A History of Tampa. Each one of the chapters really stands on its own, and this is one of them. When I was writing the book, I had nothing for World War I, and it's there's no mistake for that because hardly anyone has written about Tampa during World War I. There's really very little information written by historians, in the last century or so. So I knew I wanted to do something, but I had no idea what. And I think most people would be able to relate to this. It was a complete accident how I first came across it. So I was looking for stuff on devil crabs, but I found a devil crab man, and it's how the chapter more or less opens with a devil crab man, a vendor on the street getting arrested for having glass in his bread. And so, of course, the larger story was way more interesting than devil crabs. So I started to pull on that thread a little bit. And as I found more, I found that it was traced back to this bakery. And then there was a big brouhaha about it and a lot of controversy about just who was putting, glass in bread. Was it part of this kind of war rumor, or, was it something bigger? And really, I was surprised to find that it was a very widespread thing all over the country. People were panicked about ground glass being put in the food supply by Germans, ground glass being put in medical bandages by German women who had infiltrated the Red Cross, and a lot of just really far-fetched, harebrained ideas, and that, of course, this whole ground glass thing, people are still asking like straight dope and people today about, like, can you die from this? And the answer is no, really. That the glass has to be really coarse for it to hurt you. So this is something that's been pulled out of fiction again and again and again. You still see it in modern shows today where, someone's getting fed glass and he's getting sicker and he dies and no one knows why. So, this is a great example of sort of American nativism fusing with this, this lively imagination to create this, this rumor. And then there was lots and lots of other rumors. If you read some newspapers and believed them, there were Germans just running around unhinged, burning down American cities and factories wholesale, just with no one stopping them. Somehow people in Washington don't have a clue. So it created this perception that we were living in a very dangerous, lawless landscape, when in fact, if you knew the real story, none of this stuff was really happening, and that if a munitions ship blew up, it's because someone working on that ship was smoking a cigarette or something, often it's just user error, type of thing. But anytime something like that happened, it had to be kind of ascribed to the Germans. And so really, by the time that we even entered the war, there was a lot of paranoia already, and then all this stuff was kind of ready to pop out. But it's interesting, just the ground glass in food story, how far back that goes. It fused by having it put in bread and people thinking that it's in bread and food supply. It fused with this real paranoia and a real genuine paranoia about where their food's coming from. And all these things were in place already. So a lot of people were moving into the city. They didn't necessarily trust the German baker down the street or the Italian bakers who were, beating the dough with their hairy arms. This idea that, bread had to be completely sanitary When you make bread by letting bacteria grow, and I don't know, the whole thing is very interesting. So what I found was so interesting that this whole rumor hadn't really been explored very much, and very few sources even mentioned it after the fact. And to me, that how could any story of the home front be complete without this story? Because it just, once it entered the echo chamber of the newspapers, everybody is either talking about glass and bread and children bleeding out of their mouths, or half the editors going, "This is nonsense. Stop printing this stuff." But it's a story that just had legs and just kept going on and on and on. And it's just so similar to the kinds of things that we go through today with false narratives about news stories and everything else, and how they really seem to creep up almost organically, and then people can't get enough of it.
Yes, in your article, you also talked about other ways that folks in Tampa were being paranoid about Germans, and one of the targets was the German American Club. And I wonder if you could tell me more about the German American Club.
Yeah, there were lots of them all around the country. There was one in Jacksonville at the time. They were organized under a national charter for the German American clubs nationally. And yeah, and lots and lots of towns had them, because most towns had sizable German populations. It was one of the kind of building blocks of immigration in this country, um, especially in the 1800s. So by the time World War I came around, we already had sizable German communities everywhere. What's really interesting about Tampa's German Club is its membership extended far beyond Germans themselves. So a lot of other people were joining the club for probably business opportunities. Maybe they just liked the beer and the singing, because there was lots of singing and there was lots of beer. I mean, and it goes to show you that, like, Tampa's club, along with lots of other clubs, had disbanded, right at the end of World War I, and never came back until Prohibition was repealed. They really felt that you couldn't have a proper meeting of Germans without involving beer somehow. So this is a really important thing, and that all this stuff fuses with nativism and prohibition, so that really it's hard to imagine Prohibition passing without World War I. But I'm getting into my next chapter on that issue. So the German American Club was, it was an important landmark and a very respected place until the war happened. Jacksonville's club, immediately when we became involved in World War I, in April of 1917, they immediately threw open their doors to the Red Cross. Anything having to do with the war, they would help with. So Tampa's club did the same thing the following day. So this is like right in the opening days of the U.S. joining the war. So they wanted to get ahead of any perception that they were supporting the Germans, because for a long time we weren't in the war. We were kind of on the sidelines, and German clubs were openly raising money for the German cause. And I think it's important to note that there was kind of a press blackout in Germany. So all of the propaganda that we got in the United States was from the British point of view. So along with bonds of language for a lot of Americans, or most Americans, that was something that created an affinity for the British side, along with lots of other issues. But so, at the same time that the Germans are supporting the war effort on the German side, they're also fighting Prohibition and all this stuff, and it really kind of created a perfect storm. But so the German American Club was eventually sacked by the end of the war. It was, kind of looted and vandalized by a bunch of pro-Americans. This is really towards the end of the war too. And what had happened is President Woodrow Wilson had done what Teddy Roosevelt had threatened to do, which was revoke the charter, the national charter for German American clubs everywhere. And by losing that charter, they basically didn't have a right to exist, at least as a national organization. So that put an end to German American clubs, at least briefly, everywhere. And Tampa's never really recovered. The other thing to point out about the German club too is that a lot of its members were Jews, were European Jews as well. And this is, before World War II, where a lot of Jews would think of themselves afterwards as Jews first, and Germans or Europeans in a far second. So, overnight, the involvement in the war changed the German American Club. And, slowly things like German music were considered to be um, hate speech, or like, speech that's supplied comfort to the enemy. So there was a lot, some controversies about that as well. But what I find most interesting is the day that the German club was ransacked, nothing appeared in the newspapers. All the newspaper people decided that it was probably a little embarrassing, and that they decided not to cover it at all. And it wasn't until, maybe 70, 80 years later that Leland Hawes wrote about it and found an eyewitness who was actually there. So thanks to him for that, because otherwise we would have had nothing, not even a clue. But I'm pretty sure it happened probably in September of 1918, just a couple months before the war ended.
Oh, yes, and according to your article, there were other aspects of paranoia and just anti-German sentiment pertaining to some other folks. I was wondering if you could tell me about Ernest Cramer, the president of Tampa Shipbuilding and Engineering, and how the folks in Tampa kind of turned on him, even though he was, an industrious citizen and of Tampa. What's not to like about this guy? And so I was wondering if you could just tell me a little bit more about him, because it kind of, just shows that the wartime anxiety and paranoia and rumors just infiltrated Tampa in a way that I had never heard of before. And it's interesting, like you say, it didn't get a lot of press because it didn't make Tampa look very good.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what you tend to hear about a lot in Tampa is the USS Tampa, and then the ship that got sunk and everything. And really, it doesn't tell you anything about what Tampa was like. It tells you about this story of a ship. But so Ernest Cramer was a leading citizen in Tampa, and really, he should be one of these guys that, you mentioned, along with all the other, kind of founding fathers of businesses and industries in Tampa that really made it what it is today. So he was really responsible for bringing shipbuilding and a lot more industrial development to Tampa's waterfront. So he had a background as a shipbuilder. Like you said, is very industrious immigrant from Germany. One of the reasons why he left, incidentally, was the militarism in Germany, and that he didn't want to serve in the military, didn't want to be part of that kind of. Prussia had really imposed its militarism on Germany as a whole, and a lot of Germans, especially in the South and places like that, didn't jibe with the way they were brought up. So he ended up, here in Tampa, along with one of his brothers and a sister, and he founded one of the first kind of shipmaking foundries here in Tampa. And it was a small operation at first, but it was in place by the time of the Spanish-American War, when he was not like a CEO, he was still a shipbuilder, and worked to where they had to cut his boots off at the end of a 5-day shift at one point. Because his feet were so swollen. So this is the kind of work that he was willing to put in. And when the war came around, there wasn't a lot of gratitude. For a lot of people in Tampa, they were very excited about the idea that we're going to be able to make ships for the war effort. We're going to be able to get federal contracts, and indeed, Tampa's facilities did. I think we made more than 10 ships during the war. So, and Cramer himself went to Washington, D.C. when we joined the war to look into contracts, and came back with all this great news, and everyone's excited, until anytime something went wrong, it was assumed that there was some kind of diabolical motive. So, one of the first things was the selling of Liberty bonds, and Liberty bonds were like a litmus test for patriotism here in the U.S. If you didn't buy a Liberty bond, then you just weren't American enough. You would come up with the money somehow. And especially if you were someone who had a commercial business or something like that, you were expected to support it full hilt. And when Cramer was asked to buy Liberty bonds, he refused. And not only did he refuse, but he gave some reasons why, and that basically he didn't give up militarism in Germany to take it up here in America, more or less, and that he was willing to support the war and to run his business and everything else, but that the money was going towards the blockading of Germany. and it was for the average citizen in Germany, it was pretty desperate by the end of the war as far as just starvation, malnutrition, things like that. So he just didn't want to contribute to that, but it wasn't good enough for the people who asked. One of the people on the committee to sell these Liberty bonds was worked for one of the local newspapers. So his little speech was written, maybe exaggerated for effect, who knows. So once everyone read that, Ernest Cramer became, an enemy resident, really, and someone who was, by running the shipbuilding here in Tampa, they thought that he would be undermining the war. He might put, something in the ships to make them sink, an equivalent of a ground glass, hidden sabotage type of thing. So his name really got dragged through the mud, along with his brother Paul, his sister. I forget her name. Anyhow, so it manifested itself in a lot of different ways. But in one particularly ugly incident, the mayor at the time here, D.B. McKay, sort of had a show trial, kind of, in a way, at City Hall, where he allowed the residents of the city to really grill these people, Paul and Ernest Cramer, about their involvement. And then there was, why didn't they have an American flag flying over? And I guess they were just replacing the flagpole, and that wasn't good enough for a lot of people. So what's interesting about Tampa is that, on the one hand, there's a lot of this distrust of the federal government left over from the Civil War. So if there was problems, here over labor issues or whatever, you would mobilize a local population, a vigilance committee, give them all axe handles and they take care of it. But during the war, there was this idea that the federal government was out to lunch, and that they were the true patriots, and that if only Washington knew what these Cramer people were doing and what they were really about. So they were constantly overriding the federal judge who was on site, who was kind of making determinations about how that business would be run, et cetera, and saying that he didn't know anything. So it's a very interesting and convoluted story, I guess.
Definitely. Well, I appreciated your article, and I'm a historian of Florida history. That's my area that I like to look into. And my family's actually from Tampa. My grandparents got married at the Tampa courthouse, that I think is now a converted hotel or something.
Right.
They got married there in like the 20s. So my family history goes back to Tampa a bit. So thank you for your article. And I wonder if there's anything you'd like to add about your article before our interview concludes.
It really scratches the surface about what was going on in Tampa at the time and other places, but I'm sure, I've found so many of these ground glass incidents everywhere. I've been doing research for kind of a nationwide treatment too, just because it is so interesting, and so it was just so pervasive and impossible to fight. And it just feels like we're stuck in that same story today, just without the glass.
I was actually going to say something about that too. Like, wow, this is it kind of reminds me of now a little bit, the conspiracy theories, the nativism, the paranoia, just people repeating things that aren't true, but to make it seem true enough to where a mass of people believe something.
Right.
So yeah, I agree with that.
Well, and I think for most people, it's easier to believe stories that are bad stories about people than good stories. And those travel the fastest. Those are the ones people want to talk about the most. And I think it might say more about the people hearing the stories than the stories themselves, about what kind of story you choose to believe without any evidence.
That's right, with no evidence. Because I was looking at your article and I thought, okay, people are claiming that hundreds of incidents of this are happening,
Right.
and then in your article, basically, there's no evidence, and that's just interesting how that can happen. I mean, I could see it happening, I guess, a little over 100 years ago, but it's interesting that it still goes on today, even with all the information at our fingertips.
Right. Right. Yeah, you can't change human nature, right?
That's right. Well, thank you so much for your article. It was really nice to talk to you. I hope I can meet you in person someday.
Thank you. Yeah, come out to Tampa sometime. We'll get a sandwich.
Oh, I'd love that. I really am due for a trip to Tampa. I want to stay at that hotel where my grandparents got married. I'd love to check it out, and I'd love to have a sandwich with you.
Yeah, sounds good.
Alrighty, take care.
Hey, thanks. Have a good one.
That was Andy Huse talking about his article in the winter 2019 issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly called War, Fear, and Bread in Tampa, 1917-1918. Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in Florida. The Florida Historical Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the journal are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast and that you'll consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. Thank you again for listening to the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast.